Welcome to this week's Short Clip Friday podcast. Each Friday, I'll be posting 10 to 15 minute segments from previous podcasts. And the point here is just to bring you some of the highest yield topics from each podcast in order to kind of reinforce those topics. This clip covers a few neurological disorders that you might see on the MCAT and is from the second podcast that I did, and that was on the nervous system. Enjoy. So I'm going to go over the 5 most common neurological disorders that you're going to see on the MCAT. The first is schizophrenia, then Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, depression, and last but not least, I'm going to go over Corsicoff Syndrome. Schizophrenia is the first disease I'm going to go over. And so I'm going to start out here talking about the symptoms. And so there's 3 main symptom categories in schizophrenia. Number 1 is positive symptoms. Number 2 is negative symptoms. And the third is cognitive symptoms. And so positive symptoms are symptoms that are added on to your normal behavior. They're in addition to your normal behavior. And so in schizophrenia, these are hallucinations and delusions. And then there's negative symptoms. And so this is things like blunted emotions, withdrawal, and negative emotion or negative symptoms are things that draw from your normal behavior or they take away from your normal behavior. So, you're withdrawing from your friends, stuff like that. And then last is the cognitive symptoms that go along with schizophrenia. And these are being messy and disorganized or having trouble paying attention. And these are just abnormal cognitive functioning. It is also important to note that these cognitive symptoms are the biggest predictor in terms of looking and predicting if someone is going to have full functionality that has schizophrenia. Positive and negative symptoms of schizophrenia aren't as big of predictors in determining if someone is going to be a very functional human being while having schizophrenia. Another interesting characteristic of schizophrenia is the fact that it is an early onset disease. And so most people are actually diagnosed by the time they are around the age of 18 or 19 years old. So late adolescence and early adulthood are the peaks for the onset of schizophrenia. It's also important to understand the biological basis for schizophrenia. And so part of it is known to be genetic or hereditary. There's a pretty big link between your relatives having schizophrenia and you having schizophrenia. Also, in the brain, people with schizophrenia tend to have increased dopamine and tend to have thinner cerebral cortexes, and also, in general, have a reduction in total tissue size of the brain. And it's not necessarily known that these brain abnormalities are necessarily a cause more than a symptom of schizophrenia. That's still a place of ongoing research. So the next disease I'm going to talk about is Alzheimer's. The disease symptoms itself are very variable. A person with Alzheimer's can live typically 4 to 8 years after diagnosis, but some can live up to about 20 years. It just depends on a lot of different factors. But overall, the disease progresses from mild to late stage in the following manner. So in the early stages of Alzheimer's, a person usually can function relatively independent. Eventually, they start having memory lapses, forgetting familiar words or, where they live, friends, family members, just kind of basic everyday things they start to forget. And then it starts to progress further, and at which point people begin to be very forgetful about their own history. They experience changes in their physical abilities, such as being able to walk, and eventually it can progress to the point where they no longer have their involuntary control over their muscles, no longer functions, and that can result in death. Obviously, if you can't breathe or your heart stops beating, it's not a good thing. And pneumonia is actually one of the leading causes of death for people that have Alzheimer's, just because they their ability to swallow is impaired, and they end up improperly getting bits of food or drink into their lungs, which is not good and causes pneumonia, and a lot of people end up dying that way. Still, the most important thing to understand for the MCAT is the biological basis for Alzheimer's disease. And so there's two main pieces to this biological basis that you should know. The first is the beta amyloid plaques. These beta amyloid plaques form from the breakdown of a larger protein called the amyloid precursor protein. And so when these are broken down, they form these highly insoluble aggregates that basically deposit in the brain, usually between neurons, and they actually mess with the cell-to-cell communication between these neurons, which leads to a lot of the symptoms you see with Alzheimer's, a lot of the memory loss. And these plaques, once they start to form, they form faster and faster, which is why you see such a degradation in someone's cognitive abilities as the disease progresses. Another biological marker in the brain of Alzheimer's disease are called neurofibrillary tangles. And these neurofibrillary tangles form in a similar manner to how the beta amyloid plaques form. So these tangles form when a protein called tau, starts to aggregate together, and basically what happens is, in normal circumstances, this tau protein stabilizes microtubules that run the length of the axon. And so what happens when someone has Alzheimer's is that these tau proteins become aggregated, and these microtubules are no longer stabilized, and they begin to disintegrate. And so what normally happens is these microtubules within the neurons function to basically regulate transport from one side of the neuron to the other. And it's important to mention that both amyloid plaque formation as well as the neurofibrillary tangle formation are topics of research today. So nothing's necessarily settled. The science isn't necessarily settled. A lot of this is ongoing research as to how these events start and how exactly they proceed. But what is known is these are two very classic hallmarks of Alzheimer's disease. All right, so moving on now to the next disease. We'll talk a little bit about Parkinson's. Parkinson's typically presents itself as uncontrollable muscle tremors, also stiff muscles or trouble moving your muscles. And so, the classic example is someone trying to eat cereal with a normal spoon, but they can't because they stick the spoon in, they try to bring it up to their mouth, but they have such bad tremors that, the cereal, the milk is going everywhere. And so there's two main hallmarks to this disease that you should understand in terms of biology. The first is there's a change or loss of neurons that make up the substantia nigra. And so the substantia nigra is a part of the midbrain, and it plays a big role in reward and movement. And in Parkinson's, what happens essentially is that neurons within the substantia nigra die and form these kind of black blotches, if you were to look at it under a microscope slide. And so this is known as discoloration of the substantia nigra, or darkening of the substantia nigra. And the other thing you should know about Parkinson's in terms of biological basis is the formation of Lewy bodies. And so Lewy bodies are these formations or these aggregates of protein that form inside of nerve cells. Again, leads to nerve death. And these aggregates form from a protein that's called alpha-synuclein. And the next neurological disorder I'm going to talk about is depression. And I think depression, at least when I was studying, is the most complex of these in terms of different biological things that are going on in the brain, as well as a range of symptoms. So symptom-wise, depression usually takes a form of a persistent feeling of sadness or loss of interest, and can range from changes in sleep and appetite to energy level, concentration, daily behavior, self-esteem, and it can also be associated with thoughts of suicide. And there's a few different symptoms that are worth noting, and I've grouped them in terms of things that are decreasing in the brain, things that are increasing in the brain, and then things that are abnormal in the brain. And so I guess you can consider decrease or increase abnormal, but by abnormal I just mean different, not necessarily increase or decrease. So for the decreasing wise, the size of the frontal lobe decreases, as well as a lot of different neurotransmitters decrease. And these neurotransmitters are things like epinephrine, dopamine, and serotonin. And I talked earlier about selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, or SSRIs. And then next, you see an increase in the size of the limbic structure, which is something I want to talk about next. You also see an increase in stress hormones, as well as an increase in glucose metabolism within the amygdala, which is a symptom of basically stress. And then lastly, you see abnormal neuroplasticity, which is just a fancy word for the way that the neurons are hooked up to each other. And so last but not least is Corsicoff Syndrome. And so Corsicoff Syndrome is accompanied by memory loss and confabulation. And all confabulation is just a memory error, and it's defined as the production of fabricated, distorted, or misinterpreted memories about oneself or the world without the conscious intention to deceive. And so people are usually very confident about a confabulation. They think it's real, when in reality it's not. And the cause of Corsicoff syndrome is very well defined. It's simply caused by a lack of vitamin B1, which is also called thiamine. And thiamine, in the form of thiamine pyrophosphate, plays a major role in glucose metabolism. It acts as a cofactor for the pyruvate dehydrogenase complex, which I will get to metabolism a little bit later in a different podcast. And hopefully by the time you're listening to this, that one will be up and you can go check it out. All right, now on to the limbic system.